Boston in the mid-19th century was a city gilded in prosperity, yet shadowed by secrets that money and social status often concealed. The year was 1852, and the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill glowed warmly beneath the flickering light of gas lamps. It was here that wealth concentrated most heavily, where houses rose with austere grandeur and doors opened only to families of unquestioned reputation. But beneath this veneer of order and respectability, tragedies had begun to unfold that defied coincidence. Between March of 1852 and October of 1853, 7 young men, all from Boston's most prestigious families, had perished under circumstances declared accidental by the coroner. Each incident was dismissed as misfortune, the kind of tragedies even privilege could not prevent. A fall here, an illness there, an unfortunate mishap that claimed a promising life too soon. Yet the city's physicians, policemen, and judges asked no further questions, preferring the comfort of official rulings to the inconvenience of suspicion. What was never officially connected, or perhaps deliberately ignored, was the fact that each of these young men had signed an unusual contract with a wealthy widow of Beacon Hill, Margaret Lawrence, exactly 9 months before his untimely death. The Lawrence mansion dominated Mount Vernon Street, a 4-story red brick edifice fronted by wrought iron fencing and shaded by mature elm trees that stood like silent sentinels. The house had been built in 1798 by Josiah Lawrence, a shipping magnate whose fortune swelled during the Napoleonic Wars. His grandson, Thomas Lawrence, carried the wealth forward, investing aggressively in the textile industry, and by the mid-19th century, the Lawrence name commanded both influence and respect in Boston's social and economic spheres. But in February 1851, Thomas's sudden death shook the household. He had fallen down the grand staircase during a dinner party attended by men of stature, a congressman, 2 judges, and the mayor himself. The coroner declared the death accidental. He had been drinking that night after all, and even the grandest homes were not immune to such mishaps. Still, the whispers lingered. Why had Thomas's widow, Margaret, seemed more determined than devastated after his funeral? At 43, Margaret Lawrence was striking, her severe beauty framed by gray eyes that assessed rather than admired. She had been born Margaret von Haussmann in Prussia, arriving in Boston at 19 when her father, a professor of natural philosophy, secured a teaching post at Harvard. She quickly absorbed the manners and speech of Boston society, but retained the faint accent that betrayed her foreign birth. Within these circles, she married Thomas Lawrence, and though she played the role of dutiful wife, those who knew her best noticed a restless intensity. After her husband's death, her mourning period was scrupulously observed. Black gowns worn for the requisite time, public composure maintained. But there was something unusual about her grief. It appeared less like sorrow and more like liberation, as though Thomas's death had released her to pursue ambitions long suppressed. Margaret's 3 daughters, Catherine, 22, Elizabeth, 20, and Anne, 18, lived under her watchful eye within the confines of the mansion. Before their father's death, they had been seen in church pews, presented at social gatherings, and visited by eligible young men. After the funeral, however, they all but vanished from public life. Neighbors rarely saw them, and when glimpsed through the mansion's windows, they appeared pale and withdrawn, drifting through rooms like spirits bound to their home. Boston society, governed by rigid expectations, murmured at the oddity but ultimately excused it as an extended mourning. Yet time pressed. Daughters of wealthy houses were expected to marry, to forge alliances, to secure futures that preserved their families' fortunes. Remaining cloistered indefinitely was not an option unless their mother intended something far different from polite courtship. It was Dr. Samuel H. Witt, a young physician newly established on Charles Street, who first began to sense that something was deeply wrong in the Lawrence household. At 27, Samuel had completed his medical training at Harvard only months earlier, driven by both ambition and an ethical devotion to his craft. His own background was modest, his father a schoolteacher in Salem, and his education funded partly by tutoring wealthier classmates. Choosing Beacon Hill for his practice had been strategic. Serving the affluent could build both reputation and opportunity, but progress was slow. The entrenched families clung to their trusted doctors, men whose loyalty was measured not only in skill but in silence. Samuel earned patience gradually, often by tending to servants and clerks who needed affordable, attentive care, and it was through one such patient that the first thread of the Lawrence mystery was revealed. In May 1852, a feverish maid named Bridget O'Sullivan arrived at Samuel's office. While he prepared her tonic, she mentioned her mistress was hiring new staff, particularly young women, to work in a separate wing of the Lawrence mansion. "Is it a large household?" Samuel asked casually. Bridget's reply carried a strange note. "Larger than you might think, Doctor. Mrs. Lawrence keeps many rooms occupied, though few ever see who occupies them." Before Samuel could probe further, Bridget deflected the topic. Yet the remark lingered. It hinted at something hidden, something that demanded secrecy. As months passed, rumors surfaced in hushed tones from other servants. They spoke of young men visiting the mansion at odd hours, of rooms locked on the third floor, of the Lawrence daughters seen less as individuals and more as instruments of their mother's will. Samuel, driven by equal measures of curiosity and conscience, began to observe more carefully. He noticed the mansion's windows shuttered during times when families of status would typically display their domestic grace. He noted the absence of the daughters at church, the silence of a house that should have been alive with youthful presence. The whispers of servants were not idle gossip. They carried the weight of truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Samuel did not yet know the full extent of what was happening behind the iron gates of the Lawrence estate, but he sensed it was something more than eccentricity, something that reached into the darker possibilities of human ambition. What he would eventually discover would test the boundaries of his profession, his courage, and his very faith in human decency. Boston's prosperity in the early 1850s masked an undercurrent of fragility, for beneath the splendor of Beacon Hill's gaslit streets and grand facades lay industries beginning to tremble under change. The textile mills that had enriched families like the Lawrences now faced new competition from Lowell and other rising mill towns, and the ever-intensifying debate over slavery threatened to destabilize the supply of Southern cotton. In parlors and drawing rooms, the wealthy spoke quietly about these dangers, understanding that fortunes could vanish as swiftly as they were made. Preservation of social standing, therefore, demanded vigilance, shrewd planning, and often unspoken sacrifices. Margaret Lawrence understood this better than most. Having been raised in Prussia among her father's circle of natural philosophers and early anthropologists, she had been exposed to unsettling theories, ideas that the human race itself could be shaped, refined, and perfected through careful selection, much like livestock improved through breeding. While Boston's elite traced genealogies for pride of lineage, Margaret studied bloodlines with cold purpose, scanning for signs of strength, intelligence, and longevity. When she married Thomas Lawrence, she recognized in his family's history the very qualities her father's colleagues described in their writings. And though Thomas dismissed such theories as impractical or irreverent, she quietly absorbed them, waiting for her chance. His sudden death gave her not just freedom but resources, control over an immense fortune, authority over her daughters, and the opportunity to apply the principles of selective heredity to human beings in a way no woman in Boston society had dared imagine. She envisioned creating a line of children who would be more than heirs to wealth. They would be superior in mind and body, a living testament to scientific ambition. To achieve this, she devised a chillingly rational plan: Choose young men from families of impeccable health and intellect. Secure their participation through contracts promising generous sums, and ensure their silence through both legal wording and, when necessary, permanent removal. The daughters, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Anne, would not marry for alliances as society expected. Instead, they would serve as instruments in their mother's grand experiment, bearing children bred from handpicked bloodlines. The young men were never to remain, never to share in the future their offspring represented. They were tools, useful only until their purpose was fulfilled. The first of these chosen men, Jonathan Lell, walked through the mansion's parlor in March 1852, lured by a cryptic invitation and the promise of $3,000, a sum so vast it could lift him from dependence on his family's waning fortunes. Margaret received him without chaperone, an act bold enough to unsettle him, and with unnerving calm she laid out her intentions. She spoke of his grandfather's longevity, his family's absence of hereditary illness, his father's achievements, and told him plainly that he was excellent breeding stock. To Jonathan, it sounded both insulting and tempting. To Margaret, it was simple truth. Farmers bred cattle for health and strength. Why should humans ignore the same natural law? Before the night ended, Jonathan signed the contract with a trembling hand, binding himself to clandestine in visits with Catherine, the eldest daughter, scheduled with a precision that felt more laboratory protocol than courtship. Catherine, pale and silent, met him with an emptiness that betrayed her own captivity in the scheme, her role as unwilling subject in her mother's pursuit of biological perfection. Within weeks, her pregnancy was confirmed, and Jonathan was dismissed with the first portion of his payment. Yet the guilt consumed him, her lifeless eyes haunted his nights, the money weighed like lead in his pockets, and his shame drove him deeper into drink until one rainy October evening he stumbled into the path of a wagon. His death was ruled accidental, but the bruises noted in the coroner's private report suggested restraint, not stumble. Margaret attended his funeral from a distance, sent flowers, and returned to her mansion to prepare for the next candidate. So the pattern continued, William Elbridge paired with Elizabeth, Henry Cunningham with Anne, each man contracted, each daughter impregnated, each father erased within months under the guise of accident or sudden illness, each death quietly linked to businesses, physicians, or officials whose ties to Margaret ensured silence. By late 1853, all three daughters carried children, and all three men lay in graves, their families pacified by money and reputation. It might have ended there, hidden forever, if not for the watchful eyes of Dr. Samuel H. Witt. He was called one November evening to tend to a servant collapsed in the Lawrence kitchen. Passing through the mansion, he noticed the third-floor landing sealed by a locked door and caught the faint sound of a crying infant above. The butler's explanation, a private ward for family members not to be disturbed, only deepened his unease. When he encountered one of the daughters, heavily pregnant, drifting down the corridor with a blank, puppet-like stare, the image carved itself into his memory. The servants whispered that the daughters were prisoners, the pregnancies undeniable, the fathers unknown, the household run like a laboratory rather than a family home. Samuel began to piece together the pattern, the deaths of promising young men, the daughters withdrawn from society, the secrecy surrounding the third floor. His training demanded skepticism, yet the evidence mounted. What appeared at first eccentric now emerged as something monstrous. Margaret Lawrence, widow of Beacon Hill, was not merely raising her daughters in seclusion. She was conducting an experiment with human lives, bound by contracts, maintained by influence, and hidden behind the red brick walls of her mansion. The discovery forced Samuel toward a path he never intended, one that would pit his conscience against the city's most powerful forces. For within that house, beneath the weight of silence and secrecy, Boston's wealthiest widow pursued a vision as cold and relentless as science stripped of compassion. By December of 1853, the quiet corridors of the Lawrence mansion concealed an atmosphere heavy with secrets, the kind that clung to the air and made servants speak in hushed tones when they dared to speak at all. Behind locked doors on the third floor, the daughters of Margaret Lawrence carried children conceived not through affection or choice, but through contracts arranged by their mother, and while society outside speculated mildly on the young women's prolonged mourning, inside the household something darker unfolded. It was during this time that Dr. Samuel H. Witt found himself drawn closer into the web of secrecy. Summoned one afternoon to treat a young maid, Mary Finnegan, who had collapsed in the kitchen, Samuel was escorted through the mansion's imposing foyer and along its hushed hallways, noting details that unsettled him more than he could admit. The faint cries of infants filtering from above. Locked landing at the third floor, the way servants avoided his gaze, as if fearful of what he might see or ask. Treating Mary for exhaustion and malnutrition, Samuel sensed the true cause lay not in illness but in overwork and neglect. Yet when he turned to leave, he caught sight of one of the Lawrence daughters, heavily pregnant, her eyes glassy and unseeing as she drifted past him without recognition. It was not the sight of her condition that struck him most, but the lifelessness in her movement, the absence of spirit, as if she were being carried forward by will not her own. The butler, stern and watchful, quickly ushered Samuel out, insisting the young ladies were not to receive visitors. The encounter lingered in Samuel's thoughts like a specter, raising questions he could no longer ignore. As weeks passed, Samuel began asking questions in the only way possible, quietly, carefully, through the servants of Beacon Hill, who trusted him as a physician more than as a member of the city's professional elite. Servants talked, they always did, for they saw what masters concealed, and Samuel's reputation for discretion made him a safe confidant. What he heard troubled him deeply. The Lawrence daughters, once visible in society, had not been allowed outside since their father's death. They were prisoners in their own home, stripped of choice in matters that defined their futures. Pregnancies were noted, yet no one spoke of the fathers. Servants whispered of strange late-night visitors, young men admitted under cover of darkness and led straight to the third floor, only to vanish hours later, never seen again. They whispered of ledgers Margaret kept in her study, books in which she wrote down measurements, dates, and clinical observations, as though her daughters were experiments rather than children. Samuel's training urged him toward skepticism, but the consistency of the accounts, paired with his own observations, weighed heavily on him. The pattern of young men's deaths, their so-called accidents, began to haunt his thoughts, aligning too neatly with the timeline of the daughter's conditions. Compelled to know more, Samuel turned to the city's registrar, calling upon an acquaintance from his medical school days to obtain copies of the death certificates of three men whose names kept appearing in whispers: Jonathan Lell, William Elbridge, and Henry Cunningham. What he found within those reports chilled him. Jonathan, struck down by a wagon, bore bruises on his arms consistent with being forcibly restrained, a detail buried in the notes but absent from official conclusions. William, declared to have fallen from a roof, had last been seen with two unidentified men whose presence was never pursued by authorities. Henry, whose death was attributed to sudden heart failure at just 25, bore needle marks on his arms suggesting injections, signs overlooked, or perhaps deliberately dismissed. Each report pointed to the possibility not of accident but of orchestration, a manipulation of evidence to protect someone powerful enough to shape outcomes before the public ever knew to question. Then came the birth of the first child in December 1853, Catherine's son, delivered under the care of a physician from South Boston whose discretion was purchased rather than earned by reputation. No announcement was made, no public acknowledgement of new life in a household that once courted society's approval. Margaret herself conducted the examination of the infant, measuring his head, testing reflexes, noting every feature with the precision of a scientist cataloging specimens. The baby, healthy and strong, was deemed acceptable, noted in her ledgers as Subject A1, and placed in a nursery on the 3rd floor where he would be raised under her principles. In January, Elizabeth bore a daughter, and in February, Anne a son, both children subjected to the same scrutiny and recorded as Subject B1 and Subject C1. Margaret's experiment was unfolding exactly as she intended. 3 grandchildren bred not for love or chance, but for deliberate design. Yet there was an unexpected complication. A young woman employed in the mansion's nursery, Sophia Prescott, herself of respectable though impoverished descent, caught the attention of one of the contracted men during his visits. She too became pregnant, a variable Margaret had not accounted for. At first furious, Margaret considered dismissing her, but upon reflection, decided Sophia's bloodlines were strong, her ancestry traceable to Plymouth Colony. The pregnancy would be allowed to continue, Margaret reasoning that the child could serve as a useful comparison in her records. But when Sophia's baby, a girl, was born in March 1854 and soon developed a troubling cough, Margaret's perspective shifted. The cough suggested weakness, a flaw that compromised the child's value in her grand design. One cold morning in April, Sophia awoke to find her baby's cradle empty. Hysterical and frantic, she ran through the halls screaming, only to be met by Margaret's icy words. The child was defective, unsuitable for study, and therefore removed. When Sophia begged to know where her baby was, Margaret silenced her with threats of institutionalization and offered her $50 to leave. Terrified, broken, but unwilling to disappear quietly, Sophia fled not just the mansion, but the silence imposed upon her. She sought out Samuel, the only person she believed might listen, and poured out her story between sobs. Samuel, hearing of an infant removed, of pregnancies treated like experiments, of children reduced to subjects in ledgers, felt his blood run cold. Everything he had suspected but dared not name was suddenly undeniable. Margaret Lawrence was not simply controlling her daughters or shielding her family from scandal. She was orchestrating a program of selective human breeding, culling infants like livestock, eliminating fathers to preserve secrecy, and maintaining meticulous records of her work. Samuel urged Sophia to go to the police, but she shook her head, terrified. Margaret's wealth, she insisted, bought silence in every corner of the city. Alone, her accusations would be dismissed as madness. Samuel knew she was right. The Lawrence widow's influence stretched wide across Boston's institutions. But now he too knew the truth, and once knowledge settled upon him, he understood it could not be set aside. He promised Sophia he would investigate further, would seek evidence undeniable even to those who profited from silence. That promise became a turning point, binding him to a struggle that would demand his conscience, his career, and perhaps his very life. In late April of 1854, Samuel received an urgent summons to the Lawrence mansion, a call that would bring him face to face with the very secrets he had only glimpsed from a distance. For Anne, the youngest daughter, had taken ill following childbirth, and her condition demanded immediate medical attention. The butler, as rigid as ever, unlocked the door to the 3rd floor with a brass key and guided Samuel up a staircase steeped in the scent of milk and laudanum, into a space transformed not into family quarters, but into something resembling a private hospital ward. The rooms were arranged with clinical order, lined with shelves of medical texts and journals, and at the end of the corridor lay a nursery where faint cries drifted through the air, mingling with the fevered groans of Anne Lawrence, whose body shook with chills from puerperal fever. Samuel tended to her with compresses and quinine, though he knew such infection often spelled death in half the cases, and while he worked, he noted everything around him, the ledgers on the desk near the window filled with Margaret's neat script, the charts of measurements and notes, unmistakable evidence of a systematic experiment that treated human life as data points. Margaret herself stood in the corner, her gray eyes fixed not on her daughter's suffering but on Samuel's hands, demanding updates on prognosis and treatment with the detachment of a scientist overseeing a trial. "If she dies," she remarked coldly, "the child will need a wet nurse," as though Anne were no more than a vessel whose value expired once the child had been delivered. When Margaret left briefly to instruct a servant, Samuel seized the moment to glance through the open ledger, and what he saw confirmed his worst fears. Records of fathers selected for their bloodlines, detailed genealogies traced generations deep, dates of visits, confirmations of pregnancies, and more chillingly, entries that noted disposals completed, with methods described in clinical shorthand. Deaths of Jonathan Lell, William Elbridge, and Henry Cunningham, documented not as accidents but as deliberate eliminations. His hands trembled as he realized these were not the ravings of gossip but evidence written in the very language of science, methodical, organized, precise. Further pages catalogued the children, stripped of names, and instead designated as subjects A1, B1, C1, and D1, their weights, head circumferences, reflexes, and developmental milestones measured with obsessive detail. One entry, under D1, Sophia Prescott's child, read with devastating clarity, "Persistent respiratory weakness, unsuitable for study, removed April 3, 1854. Samuel closed the ledger in horror, shaken to his core, and returned to Anne's side, but his mind raced with the realization that Margaret was not merely ambitious. She was executing a vision of selective breeding at the cost of human life, eliminating those who fell short of her standards with chilling efficiency. Days later, Anne died despite Samuel's efforts, her young body consumed by fever, and Margaret displayed no grief at the funeral, only brisk arrangements for the baby's care as she resumed her work without pause, her ambition untouched by loss. Samuel returned to his practice, haunted, carrying within him the knowledge that Margaret's house was a laboratory of horrors, a place where wealth and influence shielded crimes too grotesque for polite society to imagine. Yet his resolve hardened when, on a May evening in 1854, as he crossed Boston Common after a difficult childbirth case, a figure approached him beneath the lamplight, cloaked and cautious, glancing about with the terror of someone hunted. It was Catherine Lawrence, her face pale and gaunt, but her eyes clear in a way Samuel had never seen before. In a trembling whisper, she confessed the truth he had begun to piece together. Her mother intended to kill her, now that her son lived and the experiment no longer required her survival. She produced a small vial from her pocket, explaining that Margaret had been giving her doses of what she claimed was a restorative, which Catherine had pretended to drink but had secretly saved. "She means to poison me slowly," Catherine said, her voice laced with desperation. Samuel took the vial and later confirmed through chemical testing that it contained arsenic, diluted to act gradually so that her death might appear as lingering complications of childbirth. With this revelation, the conspiracy darkened further, for it was no longer confined to silencing outsiders, but now extended to Margaret's own blood, her daughter deemed expendable once her role was fulfilled. Catherine begged Samuel for help, confessing that she turned to him because she knew he suspected her mother already, and because, unlike the older men entangled in Margaret's influence, he was too young to have been corrupted by her reach. Samuel promised to protect her, instructing her to feign submission, while he worked to gather undeniable evidence strong enough to pierce the fortress of wealth and connections that shielded Margaret. For the first time, Samuel held tangible proof: the vial of poison, the testimony of a daughter, and his own observations. But even with these, he understood the scale of the danger. Margaret's power spread through coroners, judges, and officials. If she suspected exposure, she would strike swiftly and ruthlessly. Samuel's conscience weighed heavy. To act hastily could mean his own death, yet to delay risked Catherine's life and the lives of the infants already trapped in that house. He knew then that he stood at a precipice, facing an enemy who cloaked murder in the guise of science, and who believed with unshakable conviction that her crimes were not crimes at all, but progress. And so Samuel resolved, despite the peril, to push further, to uncover the depths of Margaret's scheme, and to confront not just the woman herself, but the system of silence and complicity that allowed her monstrous vision to thrive in the heart of Boston. Through the summer of 1854, the shadow over Beacon Hill grew darker, though to the casual eye the Lawrence mansion appeared no different from any other stately home along Mount Vernon Street. The windows were shuttered against the heat. Servants moved quietly about their duties, and Margaret Lawrence was seen occasionally in her carriage, veiled and dignified, projecting the composure of a respectable widow. Yet within the house the machinery of her design pressed forward with chilling determination. The infants born of her scheme grew swiftly, their cries echoing in the upper chambers where nurses tended to them under strict instructions, while the daughters lived as pale specters, drifting through rooms they were forbidden to leave, their futures decided not by courtship or choice, but by their mother's will. Catherine, now secretly allied with Samuel, endured her days with feigned obedience, while in hidden moments she preserved scraps of evidence, letters, empty vials, whispered accounts, that she entrusted to Samuel when opportunity allowed. He kept these carefully, knowing each fragment might one day form the case against Margaret. Yet as he collected proof, he became increasingly aware of the dangers encircling him, for whispers reached him that men loyal to Margaret had begun to watch his practice, and on more than one evening he sensed footsteps following him through the gaslit streets. Fear did not dissuade him, but it sharpened his caution. He turned to allies beyond Boston's elite, men less bound by social ties and more attuned to justice. Among them was Patrick Donnelly, an Irish constable marginalized by his superiors but respected by immigrants for his honesty. Patrick had seen too many deaths of young laborers dismissed without inquiry, and Samuel suspected he might believe the truth when others would not. Over ale in a dim tavern near the wharves, Samuel confided in Patrick, revealing not everything at once but enough to kindle the constable's outrage. The suspicious deaths of young men, the pregnancies of the Lawrence daughters, the existence of ledgers treating children as numbered specimens. Patrick swore he would help, though he warned Samuel that confronting Margaret directly without overwhelming evidence would bring ruin, for her influence reached judges, doctors, and politicians who owed their fortunes to her late husband's investments. Together, they resolved to proceed quietly, gathering testimony and tracing connections until the case became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, within the mansion, Margaret pressed her daughters toward new cycles of conception. Catherine, though already weakened, was to be paired again, this time with a Harvard student whose family line boasted generations of mathematicians and physicians. Elizabeth, resigned to her fate, complied silently, while Anne's death earlier that year was noted by Margaret only as a setback in her ledger. Yet cracks began to form in her careful design, for servants emboldened by Sophia Prescott's earlier flight began to whisper more openly, and one young footman, horrified by what he had seen, confided in a priest at St. Mary's Church. The priest, uncertain whether to believe such claims against a family of high repute, nevertheless recorded the account in his diary, where it would later serve as one more thread in the unraveling web. Samuel, growing bolder, sought entry into the mansion under the pretense of medical visits, using each opportunity to observe, to pocket small scraps of paper, to memorize the contents of Margaret's records. On one such visit in July, he witnessed Margaret instructing her nurse to weigh and measure the infants, dictating notes on their muscle tone and eye color with the precision of a biologist. When one infant failed to respond to her satisfaction, she dismissed him as unlikely material, and ordered he be given to a foster family in Roxbury with a sum of money to ensure silence. Samuel's chest burned with rage as he realized even survival did not guarantee freedom, for Margaret treated the children as possessions to be discarded when they failed her standards. The realization deepened his resolve, and he began writing his own account of events in a series of locked journals hidden beneath the floorboards of his modest office. These writings, he knew, might one day serve as the foundation of testimony should he himself be silenced. The climax of that summer arrived when Catherine, finding the courage born of desperation, pressed a folded note into Samuel's hand during a fleeting encounter in the garden. Her face composed for the eyes of watching servants, but her voice trembling. The note, when opened later in his office, revealed a key, a small iron instrument capable of opening the locked third floor door. "Use it when the time comes," she had written in a hurried hand. Samuel stared at it for a long time, aware that it was both a gift and a burden. The means to enter the very heart of Margaret's experiment, but also the invitation to a danger he might not survive. Holding the key in his palm, Samuel felt the weight of choices pressing upon him. To step forward meant risking his life and reputation. Yet to step back meant abandoning Catherine, the children, and the truth itself. In the stillness of his office, surrounded by the muted sounds of Boston at night, he knew the decision had already been made. He would enter that house not merely as a physician but as a witness, determined to expose the darkness concealed behind its red brick walls, no matter the cost. On an overcast evening in September 1854, when the elm trees along Mount Vernon Street swayed under a restless wind and the lamp flickered like watchful eyes, Samuel finally used the key Catherine had given him, slipping into the Lawrence mansion under the guise of a late night call to check on one of the infants said to be unwell. The butler, wearied by routine, admitted him without question, and Samuel ascended the grand staircase, his heart pounding with both fear and resolve. He reached the third floor door, the one always locked, and when the butler turned to fetch linens, Samuel produced the key and entered, closing it softly behind him. The air inside was heavy with the scent of carbolic acid and laudanum, mingled with the faint cries of infants echoing down the corridor. What he saw in those chambers froze him in place. Rows of cradles, each occupied by a child not more than a few months old, tended by nurses who moved with mechanical obedience, recording weights, lengths, and reflexes on charts pinned to the walls. In one room he discovered shelves stacked with jars containing preserved specimens, organs, tissues, even malformed fetuses suspended in cloudy fluid, each carefully labeled with dates and annotations. The cold efficiency of it struck him harder than any rumor or testimony could. For here was undeniable proof that Margaret's household was not a sanctuary of mourning, but a laboratory dedicated to her vision of selective breeding. He moved quietly, his physician's eye catching every detail, the meticulous ledgers, the ink still wet from that very day, the infants referred to only as Subject A1 or Subject B2, the notes comparing their skull measurements and motor responses to those of their deceased fathers. At the far end of the corridor, he entered a chamber lit by a single lamp where Catherine sat in a chair, cradling her infant in her arms. Her face was pale, her frame weakened by repeated childbirth, but her eyes glistened with a mixture of terror and relief when she saw him. She whispered urgently that her mother was downstairs attending a late-night meeting with a judge and would not return for some time. "You must see it all," she said, motioning toward a table covered with documents and vials. Samuel crossed to it, scanning the papers with mounting horror. Contracts signed by young men promising secrecy in exchange for payment. Lists of family histories tracing bloodlines back generations. Even correspondences with physicians in Europe discussing theories of eugenics. Among them lay a smaller book, bound in leather, filled with Margaret's personal reflections. He opened it and read words that confirmed the extent of her obsession, entries describing her belief that America could lead humanity into a new age if only the strongest, most intelligent strains were cultivated, that her daughters were chosen vessels, that love and morality were shackles to be discarded in the pursuit of higher progress. She wrote of eliminating weak offspring as though discussing diseased crops, and of silencing men once they had fulfilled their purpose, as though this were no more than a gardener pruning vines. Samuel closed the book with trembling hands, stuffing it beneath his coat as Catherine urged him to hide it. He realized then that what he held was more damning than anything else he had gathered, not just ledgers of data, but the very thoughts of Margaret Lawrence herself, written in her own hand. Yet the danger was immediate, for footsteps echoed faintly from below, a signal that Margaret's meeting had ended sooner than expected. Catherine pressed the infant into Samuel's arms and whispered that if discovery came, he must save the child and flee, for her own life was already forfeit. Samuel shook his head, refusing to abandon her. But before he could argue further, the heavy tread of the butler's boots sounded on the stairs. In a desperate move, Samuel ducked into a side chamber, hiding the child in a cradle among others and clutching the book to his chest as the butler unlocked the door and entered the corridor. Margaret followed close behind, her voice sharp as she instructed the nurses to prepare one of the infants for assessment. Through a narrow crack in the door, Samuel watched as she approached a cradle, lifted a child with practiced indifference and studied it with her gray, unblinking eyes. "Weak chest, poor grip," she murmured, her words clipped, and without hesitation she handed the infant to the nurse with instructions to remove it. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he realized what remove meant in her vocabulary. The nurse carried the child toward a side stairwell, and though Samuel yearned to intervene, he knew to act then would mean certain death and the destruction of every piece of evidence he had gathered. He forced himself to remain hidden, his fists clenched so tightly his nails cut into his palms, as Margaret returned to her desk to continue her notes as calmly as though she were cataloging insects. The butler extinguished one of the lamps, and soon the household returned to its sinister rhythm, the cries of children muffled by thick walls, the scratching of Margaret's pen the only sound of authority. Only when silence returned did Samuel slip out, the stolen book pressed to his chest, his heart racing with the knowledge that he now carried in his hands the key to unveiling her horrors. Yet as he descended into the night, he also knew that the possession of such evidence made him a marked man. Margaret would not hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened her work, and the moment she discovered the missing journal, she would unleash her influence with lethal precision. As Samuel hurried down Beacon Street with the weight of the child's faint cry still echoing in his ears, he realized there was no turning back. He was no longer merely an observer gathering suspicions, he was a participant in a battle for truth, and the line between survival and sacrifice had already begun to blur. The autumn of 1854 settled over Boston with a chill that seemed to mirror the dread tightening around Samuel, for though the city bustled with merchants, carriages, and the chatter of politics, his every step felt stalked by unseen eyes, and the stolen journal weighed on him like both a treasure and a curse. Each night in his modest office on Charles Street, he pored over Margaret's words by lamplight, reading passages that revealed not only her methods but her philosophy, a conviction that she was serving a higher purpose by reshaping humanity itself through ruthless control of bloodlines. In her hand she had recorded thoughts that chilled him to the marrow, that affection was weakness, that compassion was an error in nature's design, that the deaths of young men and infants alike were sacrifices toward a perfected lineage. She described her daughters with clinical detachment, noting Catherine's endurance, Elizabeth's compliance, and Anne's fragility as though they were instruments, not children. The journal was more damning than any testimony he could ever deliver, yet it also condemned him to constant peril, for Margaret would soon notice its absence, and when she did, suspicion would fall squarely upon him. Already he sensed her tightening her net. Patients who once trusted him began to withdraw without explanation. Whispers circulated that his treatments were careless, and an older physician, once cordial, now looked upon him with disdain. Samuel recognized Margaret's hand in these developments, her influence spreading like a poison through Boston's polite society, discrediting him before he could speak. Still, he persisted, turning to Patrick Donnelly for aid, and together they devised a plan to secure the journal beyond Margaret's reach. They placed a copy of several incriminating entries in the hands of a printer sympathetic to reform causes, a man who promised to keep the pages hidden until the time came for their use. Yet even this act offered little comfort, for danger pressed closer with every day. One night, while crossing a narrow alley near the harbor, Samuel was set upon by two men who struck him from behind, dragging him into the shadows. Their blows were brutal, but their warning more so. "Stop prying into matters that don't concern you, doctor, or next time you won't rise again." Bruised and bloodied, Samuel staggered back to his office, convinced the attack had been orchestrated by Margaret's agents. He realized then that his survival depended not only on courage, but on cunning. Catherine, meanwhile, endured her mother's watch with quiet defiance, passing small scraps of information to Samuel whenever their paths crossed under the pretense of medical care. In one hurried exchange, she whispered that Margaret suspected an intruder on the third floor, but had not yet determined who. Samuel urged her to feign ignorance and to protect herself by appearing obedient. Elizabeth, however, had retreated further into submission, her spirit seemingly broken, while Catherine's resilience became the only living spark of resistance within that house. The infants grew, their cries muffled behind heavy doors, and Samuel's heart twisted each time he imagined them treated as specimens rather than children. The pressure of secrecy bore heavily upon him, yet a new determination formed. He could no longer work alone. Through Patrick, he contacted Father O'Rourke, the priest who had once recorded a servant's confession in his diary, and together they considered how best to gather testimonies from others who had witnessed Margaret's acts. Fear made most remain silent, but slowly, carefully, a handful of voices emerged. Servants dismissed, laborers paid to deliver supplies at odd hours, a nurse who had left in disgust. Their accounts, though fragmented, painted the same monstrous picture. Samuel compiled them alongside excerpts from the journal, building a case he hoped would one day withstand even Margaret's influence. Yet the widow herself seemed always one step ahead. By October, she had secured new alliances with judges and financiers, whispering promises of support for their ventures in exchange for loyalty. Samuel knew time was running short. The breaking point came when Sophia Prescott returned to Boston, gaunt but resolute, her eyes burning with a determination born of grief. She confessed to Samuel that she had lived these months in fear, but could remain silent no longer, for the image of her vanished child haunted her sleep. She was prepared, she said, to stand before the authorities and speak openly, even if it meant her ruin. Samuel warned her of the risks, but he also recognized the value of her testimony. With Catherine's courage, Sophia's truth, Patrick's loyalty, and the damning words of the journal, the foundation for exposure was finally taking shape. Still, Samuel felt the tightening noose. On a bitter evening in November, he spotted a carriage lingering outside his office, its occupants obscured, watching. He received letters unsigned but clear in their threat. Return what is not yours and live. Keep it and perish. His sleep became shallow, his meals uneaten, his mind consumed by the knowledge that Margaret would stop at nothing to protect her vision. Yet even as fear clawed at him, he understood something had shifted. He was no longer a lone physician chasing whispers. He was part of a fragile alliance bound together by conscience and desperation, standing against a force of wealth and cruelty that believed itself untouchable. The stolen journal, the testimonies, the courage of Catherine and Sophia, these were his weapons, though frail against the power of a widow who held Boston's elite in her grip. As winter crept toward the city and snow began to settle on the rooftops, Samuel braced himself for the inevitable reckoning, knowing it would come not quietly but with violence, and that survival would demand not just evidence but sacrifice. The winter of 1854 descended upon Boston with a harshness that seemed to echo the weight of dread pressing in on Samuel, for while snow blanketed Beacon Hill in deceptive purity, beneath the drifts lay a story of corruption and cruelty too vast to remain hidden forever. And Samuel knew the time for quiet gathering of evidence was ending. The journal he had stolen remained locked in a drawer beneath the floorboards of his office, wrapped in oilcloth to preserve it from damp, yet he could almost feel it pulsing there like a living heart, its presence both a shield and a death sentence. Margaret Lawrence had begun to move with new urgency, and word carried by Patrick Donnelly revealed that she had quietly petitioned for a guardianship order to declare her daughters unfit, which would give her legal power not only over their lives but over the children they bore, solidifying her claim against any future interference. Samuel understood that if such a petition succeeded, Catherine and Elizabeth would be silenced forever, their infants legally bound to Margaret's designs, and the possibility of exposing her crimes would vanish into the machinery of law she manipulated so easily. The city itself seemed complicit, its judges and physicians dining with her, its politicians speaking her name with respect, and Samuel, bruised from threats and starved from sleepless nights, felt as though he were a single man railing against an empire. Yet allies continued to gather, and their courage became his lifeline. Sophia Prescott refused to retreat again, standing firm in her determination to testify about the disappearance of her child, and Catherine, frail though she was, promised to speak as well, even if it meant her death at her mother's hand. Father O'Rourke prepared notes from his diary, Patrick secured statements from former servants, and Samuel prepared his journals, yet still the question remained how to present this mountain of evidence in a way that could not be dismissed, how to bring it before eyes too powerful to bribe or silence. An opportunity emerged unexpectedly when a reformist newspaper, The Liberator, published by abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, sought accounts of abuses hidden within Boston's gilded society. Samuel, through cautious intermediaries, managed to place excerpts of Margaret's writings into the hands of the editor, who, shocked though skeptical, agreed to investigate further. The risk of exposure increased tenfold, for Margaret would not suffer her name to be tarnished in public, and Samuel braced for retaliation. It came swiftly. A fire broke out in the stable behind his office one night, consuming his carriage and nearly spreading to the building itself, an unmistakable warning that his defiance would be paid in blood. Yet instead of retreating, Samuel grew more resolved, for fear had lost its hold on him. The truth mattered more than his own safety. Within the mansion, Catherine lived as though on borrowed time, her health deteriorating with each passing week, but her resolve unbroken. She smuggled out one last piece of evidence, a page torn from her mother's ledger, signed with Margaret's hand, detailing payments made to the families of dead young men with the chilling annotation, "Compensation rendered, removal completed." When Samuel held that page, he felt the final piece fall into place, the unmistakable proof that deaths had not been misfortunes, but executions masked as accidents. Armed with the journal, testimonies, and the ledger page, Samuel and his allies planned to present their case not through Boston's corrupted courts, but by summoning a public inquiry, a gathering of reformists, journalists, and sympathetic clergy who could not be bought or silenced. They chose December as their moment, when society was most distracted by the festivities of the season, hoping Margaret's attention would be fixed on her elaborate holiday gatherings. Yet Margaret was too astute to be lulled by celebration. On a bitterly cold night, Catherine sent word to Samuel through a servant that her mother had discovered the missing journal and now suspected her daughter of treachery. "She will kill me soon," the note read in hurried script. "If you wish to save me, you must act now." Samuel read the words with a chill that pierced deeper than the winter air. He knew then that time had run out, that the careful building of a case was over, and that direct confrontation was inevitable. As he walked the snow-covered streets that night, lantern light flickering on the icy cobblestones, he understood that his path would not end quietly in testimony or papers, but in a battle against a woman who believed herself untouchable. Margaret had wealth, power, and the loyalty of Boston's elite, but Samuel had truth, and though truth alone seemed fragile against her empire, it carried a weight that no influence could erase once spoken aloud. The stage was set for reckoning, and as Christmas bells began to toll across the frozen city, their chimes rang not of peace but of a storm about to break. The final days of 1854 brought with them a tension so sharp it seemed to hang over Boston like the frost in the air, for Samuel knew reckoning could no longer be delayed, and that Margaret Lawrence, cornered by suspicion, would strike with all the fury and precision she had honed over years of silencing opposition. Catherine's desperate note had warned that discovery was imminent, and when Samuel met Patrick Donnelly in the dim back room of a tavern by the harbor, the constable confirmed what Samuel already feared. Margaret had summoned men of influence, judges, physicians, even a state senator, to her mansion for a private gathering on New Year's Eve, a meeting where she intended not only to quash any rumors, but to unveil her successes. The children bred through her scheme as proof of her vision. It was no longer enough for her to operate in secrecy. Emboldened, she sought validation from those whose approval could elevate her from eccentric widow to architect of a new social order. For Samuel and his allies, this was both a danger and an opportunity. If they could infiltrate that gathering, present the stolen journal and testimonies before Margaret's own circle, they might shatter the facade of respectability she so carefully maintained. But it was a plan fraught with peril, for Margaret's allies were not merely guests but guardians of her influence, men who had profited from her wealth and who would defend her ruthlessly. Samuel wrestled with fear, yet Catherine's face haunted him, the frail daughter trapped in her mother's house, clinging to life with nothing but the hope that someone might finally expose the truth. He resolved that even if it cost him his own life, he would not let her die unheard. On the night of December 31, as the city's wealthiest prepared for balls and festivities, Samuel dressed not in celebration but in somber resolve, concealing beneath his coat the journal, the torn ledger page, and written statements from Sophia and Father O'Rourke. Patrick secured him a constable's badge borrowed from a colleague, a token that might grant him entry under the guise of official duty. Together with Sophia, veiled to conceal her identity, and Father O'Rourke, whose presence lent moral weight, Samuel made his way through the snow-covered streets to Mount Vernon Street. The Lawrence mansion blazed with candlelight, its windows glowing against the winter night, its iron gates guarded by men who scrutinized each arrival. Heart-pounding, Samuel presented the badge, declaring he was called to ensure order within. Perhaps by luck, perhaps by the force of his conviction, the guards admitted them, and the group stepped into the opulent foyer where Margaret herself descended the staircase, clad in a gown of black silk, her gray eyes sharp with recognition. For a moment the world seemed to still as she regarded Samuel with a faint smile that did not touch her eyes. "Doctor," she said coolly, "you arrive uninvited, yet not unexpected." Her voice carried through the hall, silencing conversations, and Samuel realized she had anticipated his intrusion. Yet instead of ordering his removal, she gestured toward the grand parlor where her guests awaited. "If you wish to speak, let it be before men who matter." The parlor shimmered with wealth, mahogany furniture, crystal chandeliers, walls lined with oil portraits of Lawrence's past, and in that room stood judges, politicians, and doctors, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain as Samuel, pale but resolute, stepped forward. He spoke plainly, his voice trembling at first but gaining strength, declaring that Margaret Lawrence was no grieving widow but the orchestrator of a grotesque experiment, a woman who had turned her daughters into prisoners, who had selected men as breeding stock, who had silenced them with stage accidents, and who had culled infants deemed unfit. Gasps rippled through the crowd, though some faces hardened in denial. Margaret laughed, the sound low and cold, and with deliberate calm she produced her own counter-narrative, painting Samuel as a bitter young physician seeking to elevate himself by slandering a woman of repute. She dismissed Sophia as a hysteric, O'Rourke as a meddling priest, Patrick as a disloyal constable. "These are the voices of envy," she proclaimed, clinging to lies because they cannot comprehend vision. Yet Samuel did not falter. He drew the journal from his coat and opened it before the assembly, reading aloud Margaret's own words. Entries that spoke of disposals completed, of daughters as vessels, of infants as specimens. He held aloft the ledger page Catherine had smuggled, her mother's signature visible in ink, proof that payments were made to the families of dead young men. He read Sophia's testimony of her missing child, the priest's notes of servants' confessions. The room shifted, whispers turned to murmurs, eyes once dismissive grew uneasy. One judge demanded to see the journal, and as he scanned its pages, his face blanched. Margaret's composure cracked, her eyes flashing with fury as she realized her words, once private, now condemned her in public. "You dare," she hissed, stepping toward Samuel with a venomous grace, "to destroy what you cannot understand. Do you not see? Weakness must be culled. Sacrifice is necessary. This is the future of mankind." Her declaration, spoken with such conviction, revealed the full scope of her madness, and for the first time her guests recoiled, unsettled by the naked extremity of her belief. It was then that Catherine appeared in the doorway, her figure frail but resolute, carrying her child in her arms. Gasps filled the room as she spoke in a clear voice that quavered only at the edges. "I am not my mother's vessel. I am her prisoner, and if I die tonight, let it be known that she sought to poison me, her own blood, for daring to resist." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the child's cry. In that moment the illusion shattered. Margaret was no longer a widow of noble vision, but a monster exposed by the testimony of her own daughter. Judges muttered, doctors exchanged uneasy glances, and Patrick stepped forward, declaring Margaret under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and unlawful confinement. Margaret's fury erupted. She lunged toward Samuel, her hands clawed like talons, but was restrained by two men emboldened by the weight of the evidence. As she was dragged back, she screamed of destiny, of vision betrayed, of humanity doomed by cowardice, her voice echoing through the parlor like a curse. Samuel, trembling, clutched Catherine's arm as she sagged against him, her strength nearly gone but her spirit unbroken. The battle was not yet over, for Margaret's influence would not vanish overnight, but in that room, before the city's elite, the truth had been spoken aloud, and once spoken it could not be buried again. The arrest of Margaret Lawrence on that frozen night of December 31, 1854, did not end the struggle but instead ignited a storm that swept across Boston with the force of scandal and disbelief. For the city that had long revered the Lawrence name now found itself divided between those who clung to her reputation and those who could not deny the evidence laid before them. Newspapers seized upon the story, filling their columns with lurid details of secret contracts, vanished young men, imprisoned daughters, and infants recorded in ledgers as mere specimens. And though some sought to dismiss it as hysteria or invention, the stolen journal spoke louder than rumor, its pages written in Margaret's own hand damning her more thoroughly than any accusation could. Trials in that era were less about impartial judgment and more about the tug of influence, yet even Margaret's wealth and allies faltered under the weight of testimony. Sophia Prescott stood in the courtroom, her voice trembling but clear as she spoke of her vanished child. Father O'Rourke read from his diary the confessions of servants. Patrick Donnelly testified to the threats and attacks orchestrated against Samuel, and Catherine herself, weak but resolute, declared before the assembly of jurors that her mother had sought to poison her after using her as breeding stock for a twisted vision of human perfection. Gasps filled the chamber when the ledger page bearing Margaret's signature was read aloud, its cold words compensation rendered, removal completed, searing themselves into memory. The defense argued she was misunderstood, a woman of science persecuted for daring to think beyond her time, but her outbursts in court betrayed her. She raged about weakness, about sacrifice, about destiny denied, revealing herself less as visionary and more as zealot. The verdict, delivered after days of deliberation, was both inevitable and unprecedented. Margaret Lawrence was declared guilty of conspiracy, unlawful imprisonment, and murder by orchestration, a ruling that shook the foundations of Boston society, for never before had a widow of such standing been condemned so publicly. Her sentence was life in confinement at an asylum in Worcester, a judgment designed not only to punish but to remove her from the sphere of influence she had long commanded. Even there, it was said, she spoke incessantly of her vision, scribbling formulas and genealogies on scraps of paper, convinced to the last that history would vindicate her. The mansion on Mount Vernon Street, once a fortress of wealth and secrecy, stood shuttered, its windows dark, its halls silent save for the memories of cries and whispers that lingered like ghosts. Catherine, freed at last from her mother's grip, lived only a few years more, her health too broken to recover fully, but she died at peace, her child by her side, comforted by the knowledge that truth had been spoken. Elizabeth withdrew from public life, never marrying, choosing a quiet existence in the care of distant relatives. The children born of Margaret's scheme were scattered, some adopted by families unaware of their origins, others raised quietly by Catherine's kin. And while they carried no mark of their mother's ambition, the shadow of their beginnings followed them in whispers. For Samuel, the ordeal left scars, both visible and unseen. His practice recovered slowly, aided by those who respected his courage, though some doors of Boston's elite remained forever closed to him. He kept the journal locked away, unwilling to destroy it yet fearful of its power, a relic of darkness that reminded him always of how easily knowledge could be twisted when severed from compassion. He never sought fame from the case, never published his account, but in quiet moments he recorded the story in his own words, not for the world's acclaim but for his conscience, so that memory would not fade into silence. Patrick Donnelly's role earned him little reward. He remained a constable, overlooked by superiors, yet he carried himself with pride knowing he had chosen justice over fear. Sophia Prescott, though her grief never lifted, found strength in advocacy, lending her voice to causes that demanded protection for women and children. Her pain transformed into a quiet force for reform. Boston itself changed little on the surface. The carriages still clattered over cobblestones, the lamps still flickered on winter nights, and the wealthy still gathered in parlors gilded with gold leaf. But beneath the glitter lay a fracture, a recognition that wealth could conceal horrors and that even the grandest houses might hide chambers of cruelty. Years later, when Samuel walked those same streets as an older man, he often paused before the shuttered Lawrence mansion, its bricks weathered, its garden overgrown, its silence profound. To passers-by it was merely an abandoned house, but to him it was a monument to both the darkness of ambition and the resilience of truth. He would recall the cries of infants, the trembling courage of Catherine, the fury in Margaret's eyes as her empire of secrecy collapsed, and he would remember the lesson that haunted him most, that science without compassion becomes monstrosity, that vision without conscience becomes tyranny, and that silence in the face of cruelty is itself a form of complicity. Though the city moved on, weaving new stories and scandals into its fabric, the tale of Margaret Lawrence lingered like an unspoken warning, a shadow etched into the memory of those who had seen it unfold. And Samuel, carrying that memory until his final breath, knew that while victory had come at terrible cost, the truth had prevailed, and in that truth lay the only form of justice that could endure.